very nice to be here. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really grateful to the library. Thanks for having me. So my name is Molly Kate Brown, and I am author of the book Learning to Walk in India, a love story, and that's in fact what we're doing here this evening, and we will get to that. How many people have actually read that book? Wow, we have a few people who have. How many people, I know there's at least 2 of you, because I've spoken to you, how many people have actually been to India? Wow. Okay, we've got some brave souls in here. So, I'm going to get to the book in a moment, but I just want to give you a little backstory. I am a nurse practitioner. I work in the emergency room at Boulder Community Health. Prior to becoming a nurse practitioner, I was a cardiac nurse for most of my career, and I took care of patients who had open heart surgery, heart attacks, cardiomyopathy, congestive heart failure, most things heart related. And I consider myself, both literally and figuratively, a connoisseur of matters of the heart, and that is what inspires me and what is most important to me in this life. About 15 years ago, a friend of mine told me about this 10-day silent meditation retreat. And as soon as she told me about it, I knew that I would attend. Because of the experience that I had after that first meditation retreat, I made these a part of my life, and for the past 15 years, I have done 1 or more of these a year. And I'm telling you this because there is relevance eventually. But has anybody ever heard of those? They do them here in Colorado as well. Has anybody ever sat one here? You have, Vipassana? Yeah. Yeah, so there you go. So at any rate, I've always written. Writing has been something that I've done since I was a child. And prior to this book, the most formal thing I'd ever done with writing was a book of poetry for friends and family for Christmas. And it wasn't until I found myself lying in a hospital bed in Mumbai, alone, unable to walk, pretty sick, and pretty terrified, that I knew I would write my first book. So when I was there, I knew a book would happen. And that was actually 2007, early 2007. So that's a little bit of the backstory. When I was 28 to 30 years old, I'm 42 now, I was planning this trip to India. And I wanted to go to India not for any very specific reason, other than the fact that I was very drawn to India. Drawn to India in the same way that people are drawn to pick up a pen or a paintbrush, or drawn to the mountains or the ocean. So my plan was to spend about a year there, and I was going to do some volunteering as a nurse, I was going to do some meditating, and I was going to do some traveling. And while I was planning this trip, I met the man who became my husband and fell madly in love with him. And all of a sudden, the idea of being gone for a year wasn't so important anymore. I decided to scale the trip back to a number of months instead of a year, although he had said that he would wait. And we decided that the first month of the trip would be our honeymoon. And after that, Dan would return here to Colorado, and I would go on and do whatever it was I needed to do in India. So we did, in fact, spend the first month there together, and I'm actually going to show you some pictures of that before I go any further. It was adventurous. We both took our turn with dysentery, which, on your honeymoon isn't the most romantic thing to do, especially when you're dealing with a squat toilet. But I like to say, if you want to test the truth of your marriage vows, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go directly to India. So before I get further into the story, I just want to show you some pictures. Learning to walk in India, a love story. So, for those of you who have been to India, and those of you who haven't, the children in India are incredibly playful, incredibly curious. They love to be on film, so anything to have their picture taken. I mean, look at those smiles, they're infectious, and that is actually me over there in the back. I had this idea when we got to India that if I had a couple of outfits made for myself, I would blend in. You know, I wouldn't stand out. So, not exactly true. But it made me feel better. So we started on the sort of mid-south east coast. We started in Chennai. This is just south of Chennai, in a little town called Mamallapuram, which is a World Heritage Site, and the whole town has these beautiful rock temples. This is a carving of Shiva, who is, in Hindu, a very important figure. That's my husband Dan on top of one of the temples. And we discovered rather quickly that we liked the small towns because India is very overwhelming and the crowds are overwhelming and the noise is overwhelming. So smaller towns are better, in my opinion. This is a giant elephant that is parked outside of a temple in another very small town called Pondicherry, which is just a little further south of Mamallapuram. And in Hinduism, the elephant represents what they refer to as Lord Ganesh. And Ganesh is representative in their religion of abundance and good fortune. And unbeknownst to Dan and I at the time, we'd actually gotten married a few months earlier on Ganesh Day. And we didn't know that, but it took me about 3 different trips to this temple before I could actually walk up to that elephant. He was collecting coins, he was there for money, and he would actually take the coin out of your hand. And it actually took me about 3 times before I could approach that animal. And this is a beautiful little place where we stayed. This is still the southeast coast, and this would be the Bay of Bengal, and really was quite beautiful. But let me just say, when I went to get into the ocean for the first time in India, I had my bathing suit on under my clothes, and I went to take my clothes off to get into the water in my bathing suit, and it became very apparent rather quickly that me standing there in a bathing suit was basically like me standing there naked. And so I quickly put my husband's shorts and shirt on, and that is how I made my debut into the Bay of Bengal. Women in a bathing suit, not so much there. This is my husband, bartering in a market. Those of you who have been to India know how colorful and loud it can be. And here we walk into a store and we pay for things, and there, everything is up for barter. I mean, ultimately you'll pay for it, what you're willing to pay for it, and what they're willing to take, which is kind of fun. But I'm not very good at that. Is there anyone in here who also isn't very good at that? I mean, how hard is it to do that? I'm terrible. I'm not a good salesperson. So we were on a train, and this woman's husband decided that I didn't look quite Indian enough. And so out came the eyeliner, out came the mascara, and he instructed her basically to make me look a little more presentable. He also let it be known that it came out that my husband was eventually going to be leaving India, and he told me I would have no trouble finding an Indian husband. And he didn't have any trouble telling me this in front of my husband, which was pretty cute. But kind of fun to be Indian for a day. And again, here are some curious young men and my husband having a conversation on the beach. They are so fascinated by where we're from, what we're doing, who we are. the level of curiosity and is really inspiring, and they're not shy about it. And it's actually very refreshing and can be very overwhelming. Again, very, very happy, inspired, curious children who are total goofballs. So the people that we met along the way were really fun and very interesting. And this is these two are British sisters. The one on the left is a doctor, the one on the right is a librarian. And they were basically riding their bikes through southern India, which is very, very brave to do. And they were staying for a few nights in the same place that we were, so it was really kind of fun to meet them. And that takes a lot of courage. This young man was an Indian man who was a college student, and he was riding his motorcycle from the southernmost tip of India, which is called Kanyakumari, all the way to Kashmir in the north, so they call it K to K, to raise money and to raise awareness for AIDS, which is a big problem there. Less so now than it was then, but still, gumption and courage, this young man. And he was actually being interviewed. He's on his way to the radio station for an interview. He was so proud. This gentleman is a Catholic priest by the name of Father Joss, and in the area where we were staying, it was settled heavily by the Portuguese, and so there was a huge Catholic influence, and it was Christmas time, and so of course he wanted a nice donation for his church, and so he befriended us, a lovely American couple, letting us know what the lovely German couple had donated the week before. So around about the time that I was struck with dysentery, my husband had it, and he'd gotten better, and then I got it. And I did everything right, you don't drink the water, you only eat certain foods, but you still managed to get it. And at one point, I needed to go to a hospital to get some IV fluids. And so this is basically the cab, and Baba was the cab driver, and he came to pick us up in this cab to take us to the hospital, and waited faithfully for us while I got my IV fluids. But I just love that cab. I mean, it was really fun, and he had his music playing loud enough to match the rest of that display. Which, when you're nauseous with dysentery, actually doesn't go over so well. So we then took a bus up into the mountains, it's still very tropical, but a little bit cooler. And this is now sort of hill country, so coffee plantations, tea plantations, rice fields. They grow a lot of spices, and a bit more sparsely populated as well, which was very refreshing. And this house where we stayed, there's no electricity, and the only room in the house that had a bed, they basically rented that out to visitors like ourselves. And the woman ground all the rice by hand. She, was on the floor grinding everything by hand. And when she found out I'd been a nurse, I had ibuprofen with me, and she had this neck pain, which no doubt was arthritis from, the way she sat on the floor grinding her rice. I actually gave her some ibuprofen, and the difference that it made in this woman's life was pretty amazing. We take all that for granted. That is her. Her name is Savita. This is a different plantation now. This plantation was run by a German man, and they grew coffee, tea, spices, rice, and nothing was mechanized. They did everything by hand. This is a picture of, does anybody in here love chai as much as I do? So you guys are familiar, or not necessarily with chai, but cardamom. You all know cardamom. Mm-hmm. So these are the cardamoms being roasted. This is the coffee, all picked by hand. And these guys are, they have gone to the rice fields with their scythes. Am I saying that right? Scythes. And basically they are now harvesting the rice by hand, which is pretty amazing. So we're gonna fast forward to Breach Candy Hospital. When my husband left, which was planned, within about 12 hours of him leaving, before he left, my knees grew a little stiff. And I brushed that off as a result of having been on a train overnight the night before he left. And so, I was young at that time, not that I'm not young now, but I was 32 then. And so, knees are a little stiff, must be the train, no big deal. Well, he leaves, and within about 12 hours of that, my knees grew so big and so painful that I couldn't walk, and I had to basically check myself into a hospital. And I was luckily in Mumbai when this happened, so the biggest city in India, almost over 16 million people, and I had a guidebook that said, this Breach Candy Hospital is the best hospital in Mumbai, if not India, and so that's where I was going. And to give you just the quick nutshell of what happened, I developed the dysentery earlier in the trip, and unbeknownst to me at the time, I have a gene that runs in my family. It's actually called HLA-B27, to be technical. And this gene predisposes you to certain autoimmune conditions. And what happened to me is called reactive arthritis. And it is a result of an infection meeting a certain type of genetic makeup. And in my case, it was the dysentery. It can happen as a result of other infections as well. But basically, within a few weeks of the dysentery, it started with my knees. And it just so happened that it occurred literally right as my husband left. So I was now alone. My husband's on his way back to Colorado. And it actually took him about a day and a half to get home, or maybe it was even 2 days because of his layovers and because of actually a bomb that went off in Bangkok while he was there. And so he was delayed. I had no way to get in touch with anybody. So now I'm in the hospital, and I give you this picture because I was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks, and this is what I looked at. And we're now in Mumbai, so we're on the west coast, and this is actually the Arabian Sea. And these are very, very dilapidated buildings, but just to be able to look outside of my window and even see the ocean was really helpful. So, this is some of the team that took care of me while I was in the hospital. This gentleman's name is Dr. Jane, and I haven't sent him a book yet, but I will. He's a very important character in the book. His compassion, his kindness, what he did for me, he was very fatherly to me while I was there, and encouraged me because, I'm a fairly positive person, I have a good attitude, but there were moments in the hospital of definite, utter despair. And had it not been for these people, I don't know what I would have done. For the level of kindness got me through what I was dealing with. I called her Mother Teresa, and I don't actually remember if her name was Teresa, it might have been, but as you can see, didn't get much warmer than that. And this gentleman, he was sort of, can everybody see that? Is there everybody? Okay. This gentleman was sort of a combination of a janitor, a nurse's aide, and every single time he came into my room, he had a huge smile on his face. He would, the dysentery came back, so this man actually had to empty the bedside commode, and he would do it and come back in my room with my tea, because they serve tea 4 times a day in that hospital, the mark of the British for sure, and I love tea, by the way. Favorite thing to do is drink tea. But anyway, he would go to my door, and he would look out the door, and he would say, in his very limited English, "God is great." And I don't know if he knew how to say anything else, but anyway, got me through. So eventually, this is one of the female physicians who took care of me. This is actually a friend of mine. She also was a nurse with me at Boulder Community for a lot of years. Her name is Ashley. She's now also a nurse practitioner in Boulder. And it turned out, eventually somebody from the American Embassy I had to come visit me, and I gave my mother and my father's information to her. She sent out emails, because at that point, still no one knew where I was or what was going on. And my mother was so desperate, she didn't know what to do. She sent an email out to my entire travel contact list, and it just so happened that my friend and colleague Ashley was traveling in northern India. So Ashley got on a train and took the train, traveled a couple of days to get to Mumbai, and showed up in the hospital. And I don't know that I'd ever been happier to see her. Breath of fresh air to see somebody that you know and that knows you in a situation like that. And I also just have to add, they wouldn't give me any pain medicine when I was in the hospital. And I mean to tell you, the kind of, I don't do pain medicine, like it's the only time I've ever done it in my entire life when I was in the hospital, this time. And it's not because they gave it to me. It's because when my friend Ashley showed up, she'd had knee surgery from soccer injuries, and she had Percocet with her. And when she got to the hospital with her Percocet, I was finally able to sleep. So I was so happy to see her for any number of reasons. So here we are again. Eventually they got me out of bed, and it's amazing what happens to you when you've been in bed for a few days. You decondition very quickly, and when your knees are as swollen as mine were, and eventually my feet and ankles, you kind of have to figure out the mechanics again. And that is my physical therapist, Anish. I need to send him a book as well. And my husband eventually came back for me, obviously. Let's hope he did. And this is outside of the rooms in the corridor of the hospital, so my door actually looked out onto this walkway, which is where the ocean is. And finally to be able to get outside was pretty exciting. And here we are doing some more exercises. Does this look like fun in India? I hope I'm not discouraging anybody from going to India. Most people don't have that kind of trouble. And this is right as I'm about to get the okay, not just to leave the hospital, but leave the country, because after being in the hospital, I then had to spend some time in a hotel so that I could go to physical therapy for a while to get strong enough to get on the plane, to get home. And this is also a reason I advocate for travel insurance. Because I had travel insurance, all of this ultimately was paid for, as was my first class ticket home, because there was no way my knees were bending in a 90-degree angle for any more than like 10 minutes. So had I not had that travel insurance, it would have been a very expensive trip. So highly recommend the travel insurance. Okay, so this book is in fact a travel story. It's Learning to Walk in India, a love story. It's a love story about the people who took care of me when I was alone in that hospital bed, unable to walk. It's a love story between my husband and I. I get into detail about how I met him, how I picked him up in a coffee shop in South Boulder, which I did, and I get into all that in detail. But actually, the biggest love story in this book, and the reason that this book wanted to be written, is the bigger story of self-love. It's the story of remembering who and what we are. And as I told you guys, I'm kind of a sap, and I'm kind of into matters of the heart. And so that's actually what I really want to focus on here tonight. You can read the book, and you can read about the story that happened in India, but I would like to talk a little bit about the inner journey, which is kind of a big story, isn't it? Illness can be a pretty profound time to investigate our relationship with the world around us and with ourselves. And I'm sure that at some point in time, everybody in here has been struck with some type of illness, whether it's your own illness, somebody else's illness. Everybody typically deals with this. And for me, it definitely became a time that I really got to investigate my relationship with myself. When you are rendered unable to walk, and it took me about a year before I was able to get back to walking and back to work and back to my regular life, you have a lot of time to be still, to ponder, and it's not always fun time, but you have a lot of it. I believe that the reality of who and what we are is quite simple and also quite profound. I'm going to give you another slide because I'm very much a visual analogy person, and I think this slide and this analogy is a really good one for sort of the way that I see it. So, if we think about the ocean, very vast, eternal ocean, and all of the waves that arise from that ocean, I like to think about us as the individual waves. So while we're all incredibly unique and incredibly individual, at the most subtle level, we're all the same, and we're all, the fiber of our being is the same stuff. So while there might be a wave all the way in Japan, and there might be a wave in the Atlantic, somewhere up in Maine, the nature of the waves, very much the same. And so then we would maybe ask the question, is it possible for a wave to ever be separate from the rest of the ocean? And I don't really think that it is. I mean, at the most fundamental level, it's not really possible for the wave to be separate from any other wave. But I think that somehow, in our human lives, we begin to perceive ourselves very much as separate from one another, from the whole. I'm going to give you 2 more slides that I really like. So, this slide and the slide after it are both nebulas, which you guys could probably tell me more about. Pretty interesting formations in outer space, in the cosmos. And these 2 pictures, this one and that one, both taken by very powerful telescopes. And the other thing that I think about us is that there is no way that we are different from the same stuff that rolls through space, that burns the sun, that swallows universes and galaxies. And so I like to look at these pictures because they remind me of the bigness and the vastness of all of it. You know, as we go about our lives, things can seem pretty mundane at times, but when we have the space and the quiet to step back and look at the 10,000-foot view, it all seems pretty miraculous. So, if, in fact, you'll go with me for just a few minutes and say that we are the same vastness as that ocean, and that we are, at the most subtle fibers of our being, the same stuff making up the cosmos, then why is it that we don't remember that? What is it that prevents us from remembering that more often? I think it's probably fair to say that most everybody in here has had the experience, probably many times, of being stopped in your tracks by something that is so beautiful and awe-inspiring that you can't help almost but to lose your breath and to feel the awe, to feel the vastness. And in those moments, it's very easy to remember who and what we are. That perceived separateness doesn't really apply then. So when is it then that we experience that? And what is it that prevents us from experiencing that more? Quick question. Is there anybody in here who has never experienced that which I just spoke about? Most people, I'm guessing, experience that from time to time. You with me? Yeah, in those moments. My very beautiful 18-year-old stepdaughter, Jessica, has just joined us in the back of the room. Jessica, the NIWAC graduate. Say hi, Jessica. So, after a lot of investigation, a lot of being with, a lot of time to myself, what I started to understand, and I'm sure that, probably most of you understand this better than I just feel very moved to shine the light on it, is that there are very old, very complex sort of mental patterns that we begin to perceive the world through. And if we think about that which we perceive the world through, our presence, our awareness, these mental patterns can kind of start to act like a film on that lens and kind of obscure, if you will, for lack of a better word, the reality of what things are. And all of a sudden, we are perceiving things through very old belief structures. And there are two statements that I like to remind myself. One is, don't believe everything you think. And one is, don't believe everything you feel. Now, of course, it is very important at times to believe what we think and believe what we feel. But I think it takes a very, very discerning mind to begin to shine the light on the subtler layers of what I'm talking about. Another question, and this one's kind of personal, but we're getting kind of personal. Is there anyone in this room who has never had the experience of asking themselves, what's wrong with me? Is there anyone in here who has never had that experience? It's a pretty common human thing, isn't it? And that's something I want to shine a light on with relation to what I'm talking about. The times that we do that, the times that we start to question ourselves and ask ourselves what's wrong with us, aren't the times that we're feeling awe-inspired, aren't the times that we're feeling incredibly happy, joyful, light, loving. When we're feeling those things, everything seems right with the world. So it's not then. And then if we look at the situation, we start to see that the times that we are asking ourselves those questions are the times when we're having the other experiences such as sadness, loss, grief, anger, confusion, doubt, uncertainty. It's more of those times when we start to ask ourselves, well, what's wrong with me? And my question is, if we're the same vastness of all of the ocean, and we're at our very subtlest layers, the same stuff that is hurling stars through space and swallowing universes, how is it possible that there could be anything wrong with us, ever? So, what I kind of came out of this whole experience with is a really deep understanding of what I do with discomfort, what I have done with discomfort. And again, I think it warrants shining the light on. And what we do during these silent meditation retreats, and I think my friend over there would probably be able to speak to this as well, we observe what's going on within the framework of the body. And we do that in silence for a period of time, and eventually things start to slow down, the mind starts to quiet a bit, and things begin to kind of reveal themselves in a way that we can understand that doesn't perhaps happen when we're going at full speed during our daily lives. And what became very clear to me through my experiences with that, and then my experience in pain in the hospital, not able to walk, and then about a year of physical therapy and recuperation, was that I wasn't all that skilled at being with discomfort. And so that's kind of what I want to touch on a little bit, because I think it's important, because the lens through which we perceive the world around us, through which we perceive ourselves and others, is definitely colored by the reactions to discomfort. So, for example, if I'm sad, or if I am angry, there are a couple of patterns that I see very common with myself and others. And if I'm sad or I'm depressed or whatever, because that's not the happy state I've come to expect, I start to question myself and I start to ask myself, what's wrong with me? And I have just found out that everybody in this room has had a similar experience. And when I'm perhaps hurt or angry, I'm not just all of a sudden questioning myself, but now I'm questioning the person at the other end of that. So situation occurs, I have an experience of anger or maybe hurt arise in me. Well, that's arising in me. That's something that's happening within the framework of my body. And all of a sudden I am creating a huge story about the person at the other end of that. And I'm making them wrong, and I'm making them bad. And that story, which is ultimately my reaction to discomfort, becomes my reality. And year after year after year, story after story after story, all of a sudden, that lens through which I'm perceiving this divine, eternal existence is colored and layered with all of these stories. And at some point, I think that it's up to me to take the cloth and begin to clean that lens off. Because personally, I want to be able to experience things as they are, not as my history might perceive them to be. And I think that a lot of these things are typically happening under the surface, such that we're not even aware they're happening, but they're so powerful, and the mind is so powerful that it's actually in large part running the show. So there are these things under the surface that are happening, and they're sort of steering the boat, and we don't even know that they're steering the boat. So lucky for us, we came equipped with an amazing tool. We were born with it, and it'll definitely be with us until at least our last breath. And that tool is our awareness, our presence, which is something that exists way beyond the mind. I mean, the mind can quiet down quite a bit, and there's still this very strong presence, this very strong beingness that is sort of what I like to think about as the light in the temple. We think about the body as a temple, our awareness and our presence can kind of be thought of as a light in that temple. And sometimes that's all we need. I heard one wise person say once that if you turn a light on in the room, the darkness must go away. So, what then do we do with this discomfort, and how do we use that incredible tool of our awareness? All right, so stay with me for a minute here. Let's talk about two states that can be uncomfortable and perhaps how we experience those in the body. If we think about anxiety, which all of us have felt at some time or another, where do we typically experience that? Anybody?
Chest.
Yeah. Anybody else ever experienced that in the chest? Anxiety? I mean, yeah, chest. We actually have physical sensations here. And having been a cardiac nurse for a lot of my career, I mean, people are actually driven into the hospital by anxiety, wondering if it's chest pain. You know, there's shortness of breath that goes with it. The heart can actually palpitate, and we actually have to discern, is this in fact a heart attack? Is this in fact, you know, something going on with the heart? Or is this just anxiety? And especially in the younger population that we see come in a lot with anxiety and chest pain. So very much in the chest. And then if we think about the state of like extreme nervousness, where do we experience that?
Head.
Where's that?
Head.
Head? Yeah, head. Anyone else? Yeah, so sometimes you'll hear people talk about butterflies in the stomach. And I mean, that's a real physical sensation. And so typically, what we tend to do is we experience, and you can also, if you start to pay attention in the body, in the framework of the body, with this profound thing that is our presence and our awareness, you'll come to find, if you don't already know this, and you may all already know this, that other states such as, you know, grief, sadness, anger, there are places in the body where we actually experience these things. And when we start to bring our presence into these places, we sort of get an idea of what they feel like. I'm going to give you a quick analogy before I go any further, because I think it's a really good one. If we walk outside and the sky is clear and blue and the sun is shining, do we question that? Not really. We walk outside and it is a beautiful day. And when we walk outside and the sky is filled with clouds, do we question that? Not really. I mean, it's just kind of the way it is. It's a different day, right? And we know that the sun is still there, and the reality of that day is that the clouds are present. And so it is with these other discomfort, these other uncomfortable states. When they're there, they're there. And we have a choice. And what I'm really getting at tonight isn't that there's anything that we should be doing differently, but it's just that we have a choice about what we do. And we can look at these things, and instead of, let's say we're driving along and all of a sudden someone cuts us off and we have this old familiar reaction of anger, well, we can go with our mind and we can cuss out that person and we can make them wrong and bad and have a really big story about them and do that whole thing, which is pretty negative and doesn't feel good. Or, in that moment, we can use that profound tool that we came into this world with, which is our awareness and our presence, and we can, instead of going with a very seductive mind down that path, we can instead go to the place in the body where we experience that sensation. And we can hang out with it. We can make contact with that place. So it's actually as simple as making contact with the light of the presence, the light of the awareness in that place where we feel those sensations. And it sounds like a really easy thing to do. It is a very simple thing to do. In the moments when it's happening, that's the time when we can make the change and when we can start to do these things. 3 days later after the fact isn't the time to start doing this. But if we start to allow the feelings, allow the sensations to be there without making ourselves wrong, without making the situation of life wrong, without making other people wrong, if we just let them be there and allow them, they go from a contracted state which has become our reality and is coloring how we view ourselves and the world around us, and they start to relax and they start to open up, and maybe with time they even dissolve into our wisdom, our understanding. And as they do that, that lens through which we perceive ourselves, through which we perceive everybody around us, starts to polish itself. And so it's not a process that we can think our way through. The mind, the thinking mind, doesn't really have any place in this process. It's actually a process through which we can only be our way through. And it is, in fact, quite transformational. One last analogy, if you'll let me. If we think about sitting on a couch and we decide that we want to go run a half marathon. We're all going to do that together, right? Run a half marathon. Can we just get off the couch and go run that half marathon? What does it take? Yeah. And the same thing with that of which I speak. Our awareness and our presence, the more we use it, the more we give importance to it, the stronger it becomes and the more it can serve us. In those moments when it is so hard to stay because we're feeling such strong, intense emotion, feeling, sensation, and our minds just want to go, the more we exercise that presence and that awareness, the stronger it is and the more it serves us. And it really does happen all in the temple of the body. So, as it happens, the light of our true nature shines more strongly, has more room to be, and that is the love story, ultimately, that really wanted to be spoken through the events that happened to me in India. Learning to Walk in India, love story, is a great love story. It's a great travel tale, but the story that really wanted to come through those words and that really wanted to speak itself is the story of self-love. Because as we begin to remember who and what we are, as we begin to remember, and it's not here that we're remembering, it's entirely an experience. It's an experiential remembering. When we remember the nature of the wave, and we remember the nature of the entire ocean, then we remember the nature of everyone around us, and all of a sudden the experience, it can't be one of separateness, and we realize that separateness only ever existed here. It's the only place it exists, is here. And I think two last things I want to say about this. One is, this process takes a lot of strength, a lot of courage, huge determination, and trust. Massive amount of trust of the inner nature. I lied to you. One last analogy. I've heard it said that if a drop of water falls on rock once, twice, 3 times a year, it makes very little impact. But if that drop of water falls on that rock persistently and consistently over time, it will indeed carve a hole on the scale of the Grand Canyon. So I really love that analogy. So that's the love story I wanted to talk about tonight. And I'm going to show you one last slide. So when I was in the hospital, or excuse me, actually no, now I'm back, I'm in a hotel now, doing physical therapy. My husband, Dan, Jessica's father, he got to go out and tour around the city a little bit, and he went into the Gandhi House, which is now a museum in Mumbai, and he took a picture of a plaque, which I think is very apropos, and so what this plaque says is, and it's Gandhi. Is there anyone in here who doesn't think he's a very wise man? I think we can all agree on that. I believe in the fundamental truth of all great religions of the world. Religions are given to mankind so as to accelerate the process of realization of fundamental unity. So I am incredibly grateful that you guys were willing to bear with me through all of that. If you have questions, I would be quite happy to answer them. My website is mollykatebrown.com. Email molly@mollykatebrown.com. And if you are on Facebook, I have a Molly Kate Brown author page that I do put writings from time to time and events. I would love to hear from you. I would love to keep the conversation going. So please feel free to reach out if you want to talk about anything. And with that, I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have. And if you are going to leave, I just want to let you know they do have books here at the library to check out. There are books on Amazon if you'd like to buy them. My gorgeous Berkeley-bound stepdaughter in the back there, sorry, I had to throw that in. She is going to be selling them as well. So that is that. Anybody have any questions or comments or concerns? That's the nurse in me as I walk out of the room. Any questions or concerns? Or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Which hurt worse, the belly or the knees?
Well, I think it was definitely the knees. It was definitely the knees. I mean, I've never, to this day, experienced anything that painful. And eventually the feet and the ankles. Yeah. I mean, the belly was pretty bad, you know. I wouldn't wish dysentery on anybody. It is not the weight loss method of choice, although it is very effective. 10 pounds at least, you count on that. But the knees. And it did take about a year. When I got home, I worked very closely with a rheumatologist, and it finally took a very powerful immunosuppressant before, big gun, we're not talking just a little bit of prednisone, before I could actually start walking and then get back to work. And I often get the question, how am I doing now? And I'm doing great. I am not reactive arthritis free. It has not gone into remission in such a way that I don't deal with it at all anymore. I am still, however, on a pretty big gun immunosuppressant that I do hope to be off of one day. I do a lot of other natural things, and I have a really great diet, and I do lots of exercise, and I'm hoping one day that I don't have to do that medication anymore. But for now, I'm still on it. And I will also say that before I had to get on this medication, I don't know how I felt about medications, but now I am so grateful. I will take quality of life over everything else. So thank you, Western medicine.
Why wouldn't they give you pain medicine?
You know, my friend Ashley got very, very, confrontational with the doc over that, and they said they wouldn't give me pain medication because it would cause constipation, which it would have, and that's true, and they were more worried about that. They just, in India, they deal with pain in a way that we don't here. We here just don't do pain. We just don't, which is one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about being with Discomfort. We just don't do pain as a culture, and so, I think that they may be a little sturdier than we are, and they just put up with more. That was more pain than anyone should have had to put up with, and I was very grateful when my friend showed up with a Percocet, but they just said that they didn't want me to be constipated and all the problems, the bowel obstruction that could result, blah, blah, blah. They were being stingy. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering if, I don't know what your experience was, of course, but I'm kind of assuming that there was this kind of like shock, and this kind of awareness that you're talking about might not have been there until some time passes. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. Yeah, when I was in India, I was in a state of shock. And if you read the book, you'll see I went through periods of being completely terrified, utterly terrified, to being feeling completely peaceful and calm and this overwhelming sense of well-being. But much of what I'm talking about and these sorts of things, there was no way they were showing up right then. It wasn't until times passed, I'm at home, I have a lot of space, that room for the rest of that came.
So when you got back?
When I got back, absolutely. Yeah.
And the relationship you had, you talk about these people that were very kind to you. What bearing did that have on? I guess it just helped you to heal or something.
Yeah, it did, because I was alone, I was very scared, and for me, I'm a caretaker and I'm a giver. And I've taken care of people my entire life. So for me, I don't ask for help very easily. So for me to actually be on the other side of that bed sheet, literally, and be at somebody else's mercy like that was not an easy thing. And it was really hard to ask for help. So to have people taking care of me that were literally overflowing with kindness and compassion was definitely what I needed. People that I didn't have to even really ask for the help. It showed up. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Were they able to diagnose the genetic condition there, or did you find that out later?
So that's a great question, and my memory of that is a little foggy. I feel like they tested for it there. Could be wrong about that. It might have been shortly after we got home, but I feel like they tested for it there. And it took, the doctor who was immediately taking care of me was very, very good, but they eventually had to bring in sort of the head physician over the whole hospital, and he literally walked in the room and said, "Oh, this is reactive arthritis, aka Reiter's syndrome," is what they used to call it. Reiter was a German physician in Hitler's Reich, and so they don't really use that terminology anymore. They just call it reactive arthritis now, but he knew exactly what it was immediately. And just interesting to also to note this, because I did have this experience in the hospital, and I didn't really talk about it tonight, but medicine in India, Western medicine in India, is today much like it was as far as the relationships between the doctors and the patients, the doctors and the nurses, those relationships are today like it was here in the 1960s. So back then, doctors were God, right? Literally, a doctor walked in the room and any nurse would stand up and give their chair, and that's just not how it is anymore. Things have changed. But that is still how it is there, and it's really kind of interesting. It was interesting to be a part of that. As a nurse, I was asking a lot of questions. I was following my lab values, and the younger doctor who took care of me, he was okay with that. He was a little taken back, but he was okay with it. The older gentleman who took care of me had a bit of a hard time with all of my questions. He actually said to me, I quote this in my book, I couldn't understand the reactive arthritis. I'd never heard of it, and he made a comment like, "Oh, but you're just a sister. Of course you wouldn't have heard of it." They call nurses sisters there, so put me in my place. I think that they call nurses sisters there because traditionally nurses were probably nuns, Mother Teresa. Yeah. So they call them all sisters. Yes, ma'am.
Is that genetic variant fairly population specific?
It is actually. It is fairly population specific, and European, white, autoimmune. I couldn't give you statistics, but it is fairly population specific. And interestingly, my brother has a very similar condition. He has the same gene. His started when he was 18 to 20, and he'd gone on a surfing trip near Indonesia and had developed some type of illness. And we didn't really put two and two together until later, but That's kind of how his got started as well. And he's doing great also. I mean, he does yoga, he surfs, he's very healthy. But he and I have sister, I don't use the word disease, I use the word health opportunity. We have sister health opportunities. Anybody else?
So the dread constipation in India so terribly, would you want to be the primary holder of the concession for juice?
Yes. Next time we go, we'll take prune juice. Lots of it. Or maybe we'll just take our own pain pills. Maybe that's just easier. Yes, sir.
Can you recollect, when you got back, is there a particular instance where you started thinking this way that you can remember, or is there sort of reactions?
It was definitely very subtle and very gradual.
So you don't have, there wasn't a thing that you remember that sort of stood out?
No, there wasn't like a light bulb. Yeah.
Maybe a little
Not that I can recall. I mean, I can actually remember, it was such a roller coaster ride, made worse by the, has anyone in here ever had to take prednisone? Okay, so you know how emotional and terrible prednisone is, right? I mean, you know that it makes you do this, right? And so I remember having moments of utter despair, thinking to myself, because I couldn't walk, and I had a very healthy, active life. I was newly married, had these beautiful stepkids, I couldn't do much. And I can remember thinking to myself, if this is how it's gonna be, I don't wanna do it. I don't want to do it, so the positive attitude that stands in front of you today, a little more subtle, a little more gradual. And it was there too then. It just, it was definitely a roller coaster ride. And I think sometimes it's not until we get, when we're in the weeds, that's all we can see is the weeds, right? I mean, we're seeing the underbrush in front of us, the tree stumps in front of us, and it's not until we can actually start to climb up the side of a hill that we get that bigger sort of perspective. And it took some space and some time for me, for sure.
Were you already, when you felt this, when you got home, were you already into the meditation and things like that? So you had a little bit of
some tools.
Place to come from.
Yeah, and I had started this meditation practice that I told you about a few years before I went to India, so it wasn't like I've been doing it for 20 years. But I had enough of a taste of it that I had some tools. I can still tell you that it was excruciatingly difficult. It is so hard to practice this, when you're in the middle of despair. It's really hard to practice and use those tools, but that's when we really need them. It's not later when we're happy, when we're doing great. It's when we're really in the trenches, on the front lines. Yes, ma'am. Do we know each other? Because you look so familiar.
I don't think so.
Okay, you look so familiar to
Oh, I
me.
get that all the time.
Okay, there you go.
I'm a generic face.
Maybe you have a doppelganger. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know. I was just thinking though, you said when we go back, and it sounds like you would go back. I was wondering how long were you there all told, aside from your month of the honeymoon, and then afterwards?
Yeah, well, so it only turned out to be about 2 months total.
Okay.
It was supposed to be a bigger trip, and I was going to go do lots of other things, and just never got to do them. Yeah, so I would love to go back, and there are places I'd like to see, and there's no way I would go back by myself. No way. Maybe Jesse wants to go. Maybe? Perhaps? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Did you have to worry about a flare-up of your writer's syndrome if you returned?
Sure, absolutely. Drink the wrong water, catch the wrong bacteria, playing with fire for sure. But I will tell you this, and I don't know if things would have turned out differently for me if I'd actually started taking the antibiotics that were in my bag right away. When I got the dysentery originally, I decided that I wanted to be, and I'm just going to say it, that stupid bowler chick who's going to let her own immune system take care of things. And, let my own immune system fight this off, but people, this is India. We're not talking Detroit, we're talking India. So had I started taking those antibiotics immediately, might have things been different for me? It's possible, I don't know, and we'll never know. But I let it go for about 4 days until things were really bad. Because I just didn't want to take them. I wanted to, get better on my own. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything you can take ahead of time for when you do go back?
Well, we do know that grapefruit seed extract is a really great antimicrobial for the gut, and a lot of people use that before they travel to places like India. And it's just, you just go ahead and start taking it, beef up on the probiotics. But, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Shigella, you catch those. I don't think there's a whole lot you can do. Although maybe if your immune system and your stomach are stronger than mine, maybe. Well, if you guys don't have any further questions, let me just give you a very deep, deep thank you. I'm really grateful that you came, and really nice to have a chat with you guys. Thank you so much. I really